All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Tonight, our speaker is Saul Rearick, who is the Executive Director at Contemporary Craft. Rachel received a Bachelor's of Fine Art in Printmaking with a minor in Art History from Edinburgh University, and went on to receive a Master's of Public Administration from Gannon University with a focus on organizational leadership. Balancing her creative process somewhere between printmaking and painting, monoprints have become her primary visual language. She enjoys building conversations that are layered with information, working to invoke emotion through the use of color and texture, by first developing each background in an intuitive manner. Currently, Rachel is exploring the use of repeating shapes and forms to delineate space through the use of line. Following her undergraduate work, Rachel did a printmaking residency at Wilson College, leaving work in her permanent collection. Professionally, Rachel serves as the Executive Director of Contemporary Craft, as well as an adjunct faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University, teaching a course in public art. Previously, she held the position of Arts and Culture Manager for the Allegheny County Airport Authority. She is the president of the board of the Office for Public Art, sits on the board at Lawrenceville Corporation, is on the Art Advisory Committee for the Sports and Exhibition Authority, and is an active artist member of both the Associated Artists of Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh Print Group. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. It's not very often I get to talk about my own artwork, so I'm actually a little bit nervous about that. Just out of curiosity, anybody in here make prints, or is anybody a printmaker? Debbie? Okay, all right. So most of what I'm going to talk about and show you comes from wood blocks. It's mostly what I do now. That said, you probably wouldn't think that when you see the work. But I will talk about that a bit, and I guess I can skip the background and just say that this was like very, very, very early work that I consider kind of the departure into the way that I work now. So I did study printmaking specifically, and I was trained mostly in intaglio and wood carvings, but I dabbled in some screen printing, and that was this moment where color became really important to me. And I started working gesturally and thinking about line. And that's when I also decided that I really wanted to make more abstract experimental work. I wasn't making work like my colleagues. I wasn't making additions. I was really focused on just like being in the moment and being an intuitive. So at that point I switched. I was still working on zinc, and I was trying to get these more kind of like ephemeral or quick moments in time. So rolling ink onto zinc using an oil-based ink, and then coming back in with solvents and trying to create kind of atmosphere or take color off in order to then layer back on top. And then that's when I tried to go back to what happens if I put the two things back together, if I put the representational work in with the more intuitive work. So this is a zinc plate that, of course, is etched. And then this is part of, it was a series of 25 prints that I made, each of these individual kind of more intuitive monotypes, and then went back through and put the print on top of them. So that, I would say, was the moment when I really decided I didn't want anything to do with representational work for my own practice, which is really interesting because being the executive director at a craft institution, I'm really focused on objects, I'm really focused on craftsmanship, on proficiency, on all of those things, but I think that's why in my own practice, that's when I allow myself to kind of remove myself from that a bit. So then I kind of wasn't making work for a while, and when I came back to it, I came back to it in a way when I started making books. And so at first I was just making books, I wasn't making prints. And I thought, like, obviously it makes sense that I might consider how these two things would come together. So this was the first artist book that I made, and it was a series of, I think there was about 50 individual monoprints that go into this book. And the other thing that started to really happen in this moment for me is I started to incorporate thread or stitching, which, you know, in retrospect, now being so focused again in craft and being so rooted in fiber, it starts to like draw a line for me a little bit. So the other thing that happened right around this time is that I started to work collaboratively with what is my now wife, but at the time we were not married. And this was our first collaborative exhibition that we did at the Pittsburgh Center for the Arts. And what we did was, if you see this long drawing there, it's actually a 14-foot drawing that in our shared studio, every day we would spend 30 minutes in doing what we called a conversation drawing, where one person would make a line or a mark and the other person would respond, but we didn't talk at all. There was no verbal communication for this. And so we did that, like I said, I think for a month, for 30 minutes each day. And then the next thing was that I took from that drawing components and started to carve on blocks. So this is actually a door. It's kind of hard to tell the proportion of this. And I really am kind of enamored by traditional practice, even though it doesn't come through in the imagery of my work. So everything is hand rubbed and hand printed with a Baron. I didn't run it through a press. So these are incredibly large. I think they're like 3 foot by 5 foot. Again, photos a little deceiving on proportion. Prints that are essentially enveloped in steel. So you can get a better sense of that here. This is a very large sheet of steel. The print is then laid over top of it, and I actually drilled holes through the steel, and then I stitched it. This is from one of the other works in that series where I actually used small like embroidery or French knots in order to attach the work to the steel. But similarly, this is stitched in various locations, and then this is another piece of steel that is bent over top of it by Katie that holds that work in place. So that was the first time that we really worked at that scale, and this just gives you a little more detail. It's a little grainy on the screen of that close-up. I think there's like 300 knots on that one print that's really just holding it to the steel.
How was it anchored? How were the knots anchored into the steel?
So essentially what I would do is just treat it like it were a piece of paper or fiber that I would drill the hole through the steel. Then on the back of the steel, make a small knot, and there's two holes. So you come up through the one side, make your twist, push your needle back through the other one, and then tie it off on the back of the steel. So it just like holds it into place. At this point, I wasn't sure if I was going into administration or just staying, making prints. I don't have many images, but I had this moment where I tried to make a lot of greeting cards, reception cards, artist cards, and things of that nature. And again, decided, nah, I'm not doing that. But this was actually a block that was made of a rose window, like cut in half from a church. So I would say this is the moment of like fully embracing I'm making an intuitive work, and it became very painterly for me. So this is still off of wood. Most of this work was probably like 20 by 30, and I would just layer and layer colors. I would come back and carve, take a lot of like even palette knives at times and come back in. Some of these are very straightforward in terms of just being a monotype. And then there are ones that I would consider monoprints because I come back in with the same block. So even if I'm not necessarily making an addition, I usually save my blocks and find that I reuse them in different ways or in different orientations. And again, I started to become really interested in what happens if I just bring a little bit of thread back into the work. So these are a little bit smaller pieces, and you'll see that a lot of my smaller work becomes studies for the larger work. So that led to making this series of much larger prints. Again, these are cut from block, they are hand pressed, and then it's very much about building layers in space. And then I came to the place of a second collaboration with Katie, and I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to go with my work because I had worked so much in color, but I found myself really seated in this palette that I just couldn't leave. I actually still find myself stuck in it a bit. But I started to think about what if I brought some screen printing components back into my work. So what if I was still doing block, but then had some kind of line that ran through it. So again, these are all sketches in my mind. These are not necessarily finished works, even though they are numbered. So what you start to see is these components that are in the background, they are actually taken from an image of a rug within our house that I've just completely saturated or desaturated all of the color from. And I started to think about what are the repetitive images or the repetitive things that I can use in order to make the work that we would be doing in collaboration. And so we had a lot of discussion about that, and I don't know if anybody works collaboratively, but this next image, I would say, was the greatest test of myself and my own ego about my work, and also like being in relationship with another person, because the decision that we came to is that my prints wouldn't actually have the repetitive components in them, but rather I would make prints and then I would hand them over and they would be cut up and deconstructed. And that took a lot of trust and was a lot of, anxiety inducing. But what we did was we started to look at patterns within our home and recreate those within the works without them being literally visual representation. So again, this is a pattern within what was at the time our kitchen, and then you can see some other pattern in that paper that comes from the rug. So what is happening here, because this one came first, is that we chose these patterns and then the paper was incised and folded, and this is actually, again, steel. So this work is sitting on top of steel. It's held in place by magnets rather than thread. And then again, this is on steel. And in order to create those patterns, what we've done is we've cut the prints and then they've all been folded. So they're essentially triangles that have magnets glued into the inside of them once they were constructed. And then they're placed within this pattern on the steel. You can come, don't feel like you're. So here's some more of that work. Again, these, I think they were like 28 by 28 maybe. That again is a print sitting on top of steel that has a pattern incised and kind of folded. And then this is again work that the print is completely deconstructed in this case. These are small triangles, a pattern created. It's been interesting for this work is when we've sold it and I've seen it later, people just like, of course, move it all around and deconstruct the pattern, which is totally fine. But it loses, I suppose, a bit of its meaning. So then we came into another series of collaboration. These are, again, mono prints, so there is a block that is involved in these, but then I started really coming back into my work with graphite, which is interesting because I've never really considered myself somebody that focused or interested in drawing or illustration. But these were based on a trip to Iceland, and these were my sketches for what would eventually be the work. And it was at Borelli Edwards Gallery where we were having the exhibition, which is why they're titled BE Sketch. So those led to much larger prints that, again, had blocks involved, but also had graphite involved. And then, again, I came back into them with a palette knife and using my printing ink. So it's rather painterly in nature, similar. This one doesn't have as much of that intuitive work, but this one comes back into a lot of that painterly nature. So
All these from Iceland, influence?
yeah, so I should go back to, like, for instance, if you're curious, like, I was really kind of taken by the mountainsides and the hillsides and a lot of where there were waterfalls, but what really struck me were the basalt formations. So when you start to see the pillars reappear through the subsequent images, it's really trying to focus on these rock formations that existed at the Black Sand Beach specifically. So even those larger, more gestural blue marks are coming back to that. I started trying to push myself back into color, and I found that I wasn't ready to leave that kind of crystal blue. So that was an experiment, and it led to, this is that body of work that we ended up making together. So we call this sculptural wallpaper, which I have another image in a moment of that. It was, I think, 190 of these triangles that we created. Again, I made, I think these ones were 3 foot by 5 foot prints. I did not hand rub all of these prints because there's so many in this series. I worked at Artist Image Resource and pulled them from the presses, or in some cases did some screen printing. So those prints were deconstructed, folded. They are actually set on wood instead of steel, and they have 2 holes. So we have this really, really large template that essentially you hang on the wall and figure out where all of the holes are going to go before you place the work. And then it's just kind of a bit of a strategy once you get it there to try and make the aesthetic of the colors and the lines, create kind of the space for that. And then this goes back to a little bit more of me focusing on delineation of space and line, and really becoming interested more in the geometry of things and becoming a little less intuitive, even though it's pretty loose, even within its rigidity. And then you can see the work interacting. So this was Katie's work in that exhibition, and that is a piece of steel that has been cut and folded, and then treated with, it's called like gunmetal or something blue, I forget, but it's like with a torch heated. So then that mimics some of the pattern that is then on the print and sized and folded, so that these things start to be kind of in relationship with one another. And this is a bit of a close-up of what these triangles look like. So each one is roughly like this big. I started to really kind of focus on the circle and started to try and bring that back into my work. And again, really, I would say in general at this point, I'm very focused on linear work that is still having some kind of intuitive component or nature to it. So there was an exhibition that we did at Chautauqua, and I didn't get great images of that physical work, unfortunately. But these were the sketches that served for the creation of those larger prints. And then during, I would say, kind of like the height of the pandemic, I had stopped making work and then found myself in the studio, of course, like so many of us, like trying to figure it all out, and really starting to think about like being home. So like if I were to like try and explain the context of this really abstract work, this one symbol that's like that medium gray is meant to really kind of represent like home and kind of putting everything into space. And of course the two circles being the two people living in this space. So I did a series of, I think, like 25 again of these works. That it was just like a daily exploration of how am I feeling, how am I responding to this, what's going on, just, you know, with blocks, with some continuity, but also just trying to be very gestural in nature, trying to keep the palette, the same palette throughout the process. I don't have all of them in there, I think that's it. So then that leads to a residency that I did at Falling Water. So they had this program where artists were able to come and stay. Unfortunately, again, because of the pandemic, the stay part was no longer available, which I think was somewhat limiting because you had to get there, spend a day there, try to ideate about what you were going to make, and then go away and actually make work in response to just one day. So it wasn't incredibly immersive, but it was enough, and I've been there enough that I think I was able to walk away with something. So has everybody been to Falling Water? So I was really taken by the colors in the living room, and just, I would say, like the entire romance of that house and that space. So just being so intimate with nature, and the house just felt really just so romantic and inviting, that's what this print was about for me, and about creating space and being in that space. And then again, I made, this is a very small print that was based off of a larger print that was focused on the fireside, because in the main room there's that really lovely fireplace. What is hard to see on screen is that I came back in with an overgloss that has a really nice sheen on it that is meant to almost represent that kettle that hangs in front of the fireplace. And then I would say some of my favorite work is this and the next print that I'll show you. So whenever you're there, there's most of the corners have these corner windows that intersect, and then they open kind of like this, and they're all this really beautiful maroon color again. And it's the only thing that's really delineating like between you and the outside is the crisp line of these windows. So I was really interested in like just abstracting that and thinking about the intersections. So this one is really thinking about that corner of the window. And then this one is a tiny bit more literal in terms of like, if you start to see this thread, it's the actual like the 4 count, and then the 2 columns in the middle of the painting, and then the other 4 count of windows. So again, I started working the thread back in, and I like to use the thread as a line. And I generally, it's interesting, I guess, like even in the intuition, I plan where the thread will go at the very end before I start the print. So it's kind of like with that end goal in mind for the thread. And then in my own work since then, I've just been focusing on really taking everything out, like stripping as much as I can away, and still trying to have like some kind of feeling or emotion left behind, simply based because of the colors and the lines. So that's really what most of the rest of this work is. And again, these are blocks that I'm coming back in sometimes with screen printing. So most of the metallic inks I do put on with the screen because you just can't get that crisp line on the metallic from wood. At least I struggle with that a little bit, probably because if I run it through a press, it will, but if I'm hand pressing, it's hard to get that metallic. And then I come back in with metallic, or with, graphite, and a lot of that overglaze. And then I think that's just kind of where I ended. So, yeah, questions about any of that?
Can you explain what's involved in actually producing one? Like if you go back to the top one, like what are the steps like from scratch to get to an end result like this?
Like this one in particular?
For example, yeah.
Sure. So usually if I think about I'm going to make a series of 5 of these, I start by, taking whatever size wood and cutting it into the blocks so that I have usually like a stack of them to work from, so that in the moment, like I might decide, okay, all the first layer is going to be whatever color, but then I like to have a stack of things there so that as I'm working intuitively, I can like pull and mix color and then like roll and then bring that in, maybe set it there and leave it there and come back to it for a different one. And then I oftentimes will also like tape off areas and then just roll sections of the block. Or I carve it out, depending how big it is. This triangle is a screen, but in some of the earlier ones, I would just have drawn that on the block and then carved away everything around it and just left the triangle there. But generally, at this point, because I'm making so much work like this, I have a set of squares, I have a varying set of triangles, a varying set of circles, and then I just keep all of my gouges out and, trim them down as I need to along the way. So it's a lot of like trimming in the moment with a gouge, a lot of tape. I waste a lot of blue tape. And then usually the overlay is the very last thing. So then I'll take the silk screen at the very end and do kind of that glossy thing as the last bit.
So each one of the prints is basically a series of going through the blocks with different colors and then going over the whole thing with another like fine layer.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite prints. It's like that one that got away, like that I wish I didn't sell, that there's probably I probably came back to this at least 20 times, like in terms of like blocks and layers before that was complete.
So that's what you're doing. Everything is an individual print. It's not a series, or you don't do multiple pulls off of the same thing.
Well, the falling water work was an addition because they commissioned an edition to sell in the store. So I did make I had to challenge myself to make an edition of things again. But generally, yeah, I don't make editions. It's a lot of work as a printmaker to come away with one image.
Can I ask you, the colors on both of these screens are different each time you have a slide. Which one is more true to the colors?
This here, yeah, that looks kind of yellowed.
That's probably because we have the lights on that side of the room.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The colors are fantastic on the website.
Any other questions?
So the studio that you work in, do you work is it a large space? Because it seems like you work on large pieces.
My old studio was essentially a bedroom that I converted into a studio. It wasn't huge. We recently moved, and the studio is probably half the size of the house. It's the ground floor, but we share it now. So it used to be that we had separate spaces. So yeah, and then the really large stuff I do at Artist Imagery Source because I just don't have tables big enough to do that.
And what kind of printing inks do you use? Do you use oil? Do you like what's your favorite to use?
So great question. My favorite to use is definitely oil-based ink because the viscosity, like you just get really rich colors and you can do some really interesting things with them. But at home I use water-based ink just because like the cleanup and it's less toxic and I have to smell it in the rest of the house all day if I use the oil-based.
And you I would think you could move much faster in your layering of the prints with the water-based
Yeah.
as opposed to the oil, right?
Yeah, you can.
Probably dry quicker.
Yeah, and I mean, I spend a lot of time like with the hair dryer, or there's like don't remember the technical term for it, but it's like if you worked in a t-shirt shop, it's like the little oven thing that you can put a print through and it heats it up.
And that's the same way like with the coatings that you put on them, you have those available in water-based as opposed to?
The clear coat is an acrylic, and the reason that I usually put that on last is that it's really sticky. So what you have to be willing, if you don't do it last, is that it could stick to your block. Like you might lose a piece of that paper, which is also something that because I work this way, a lot of the way I work is responsive to whatever is happening along the way. And I have to just allow myself that space that like a piece of this paper might get stuck to this block and then how am I going to respond to that? So I do Shinkale and I actually don't have any images of that work here. So sometimes I will come back in and put, you know, something over top of it, or I might stitch something into it. But usually I'll just kind of print over that space.
And one last question, what's your paper of choice that you like?
Yeah,
like to print on?
I like Reeves BFK. I think just because I've beat it up so much along the process. Whenever I was working the beginning of making prints, I used like a mulberry or a really nice handmade paper whenever I was doing etchings because it was like just line work, probably one pool, and I was looking for that crispness. But yeah, now I like a heavyweight. But yeah.
So you mentioned the different materials, copper, zinc. Is that just the surface that you put the paint on, or is that the actual print surface, like the where the print ends up on?
So the zinc is where if I'm doing an etching, I would put it, like you would put it in acid and etch it, and then you would roll the ink onto the zinc. Or now I might use copper and put it in like a salt water and etch it, and then roll the ink on it. In terms of the steel, that was the print actually sitting on steel that had been treated. Anything else? Okay.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, thank you so much, Rachel. This was just a wonderful presentation.
And can I just say, like, it very different, like my personal practice than my professional practice. So for any of you who are in the very tight craftsmanship of things, especially like the pots, or if you're, you know, pottery. So basically, is everybody familiar with contemporary craft? Can I just tell you about that for a second?
I was going to say, talk about that a little bit. If you
Okay.
wouldn't mind.
So contemporary craft is essentially, we believe that we show essentially work that is contemporary art made from traditional craft materials. So wood, metal, fiber, clay, and glass. But all of the work, at least in our gallery space, is pretty contemporary in nature. We do show some traditional, like some basketry or things along those lines at times too. But we partner with the Guild for Fiber Art International. We do kind of exhibitions in clay and glass and wood. And The next one that we have is actually our regional show. So we just started hosting a regional exhibition. It'll be every 3 years. So if you work in those media, definitely take a look out. That's like an open call, and we ask people to kind of submit and contribute work to that. And then we have a store, so we sell work that is made in any of those craft materials. Anything from functional items like mugs, cups, spoons, wood turn bowls, jewelry, to wall pieces, wall hangings. There's some of that is abstract. And then we have studio spaces, so we do offer workshops in any of those materials. Sometimes the workshops are a little outside of that scope, so we might do like a collage, or we do paper making, and things
If
along
you could
those
tell them the
lines.
types of studios, because what, there's metal, wood?
There's metal and fiber, and then we have a mixed media space, but we actually are just finishing building out a fourth space, and that is our more like digital kind of fabrication space. We have a really large laser cutter, and what that is going to do is it's allowing us to kind of grow our fiber space. And then we used to be in the Strip District and recently moved to Lawrenceville, and we lost our wood studio in that space. So we're in the process of reconfiguring the back of house to reintroduce a wood studio. So wood
Looms,
turning.
right, the
We have a
looms.
lot of looms. We offer weaving classes. There's a loom club if people are interested in doing that. We do fabric dyeing. We do, again, like jewelry making from the very basic to kind of advanced. We teach soldering, so you don't have to come in knowing how to do those things.
They'll have different artists in residence, like there was the basketry gentleman who was in for a while.
Oh yeah, Dan, he owns Foggy Blossom Farm in Katanning, and so he grows all of his own willow, and then he makes baskets from it. And so we sell those in the store, and we also teach classes about how to make baskets.
It's really a wonderful place. If you haven't been to the new location, yeah, you really should stop in and see.
Are there cards or an address? Do you have?
You know what, I should have brought cards and I didn't, but it's 5645 Butler Street. And it is, if you come across the 60th Street Bridge and you make a right, it's kind of like one of the first things that really exists coming into Lawrenceville. It's right next to those kind of like gas silos for the gas company where the tanks come in and out to refill.
I can email that out to everybody. I can post the location. Yeah.
Is that like a members
No,
organization or?
great question. So we are totally free to the public in terms of you can come in, you can see the exhibitions, you can look around, you can kind of get to know what's going on. This Saturday, we actually have our community day, so everything is free on Saturday. You can come in, you can make things, there's activities in the studios. And then most of the workshops, there's a fee, but they range in price. And then we do have, it's like called Crafts and Drafts on Friday nights. That's like a lower fee, lower the kind of entry point if you're just trying to try out a material. And it only lasts for like a couple of hours. And there's crafts and drafts, so there's kind of beer and snacks for those too.
What are the hours on Saturday for the community day?
It is 10 to 4.
Great. Yes.
Yeah, there is, I get in trouble. There's a lot of great jewelry in the drawers.
Those drawers that pull out. Wonderful. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you all for having me.